Take a network break. I'm Drew Conry-Murray.
I'm Jonna Johnson.
Help yourself to a virtual donut as we tromp through this week's tech news. We're going to be talking about shareholders targeting CrowdStrike with a lawsuit, Intel cutting 15% of its workforce, DigiCert revoking thousands of certificates, Microsoft printing money in its fiscal year 2024 results, and more. We don't have any ads today, but I just want to let you know Packet Pushers has launched a brand new show. It's called Technically Leadership. It's hosted by Laura Santamaria. So if you're looking at management as a career option, or if you're leading a team and you want to refine your leadership skills, the podcast offers practical advice from a technologist lens on critical leadership skills like communication, navigating office politics, reshaping cultures, and more. Episode 1 is up and more are on the way. You can find it at packetpushers.net.
And that sounds like a well-needed show, because I know Greg and I spent an awful lot of time on Heavy Strategy talking about some of these issues, and they're tangentially related to strategy, but very, very important.
Yeah. And again, I think a lot of, folks in technical spaces feel like they sort of reach a point in their career where they're like, I just can't do the networking anymore. I need some new challenge, and management's typically the way to go. But if you want to also keep your technical roots, I think Laura's going to kind of walk that line. So take a listen. So let's get into some news. First, CrowdStrike shareholders are seeking recompense from the security vendor after a buggy CrowdStrike software update crashed Windows machines around the world. A pension fund has filed a proposed class action lawsuit in Texas against the company. The suit alleges that CrowdStrike defrauded shareholders by making false and misleading claims about the adequacy of its software testing. Since the crash, the suit claims that CrowdStrike shares fell 32% for a loss of $25 billion in market value. For instance, the lawsuit quotes CEO George Kurtz saying the Falcon software is, quote, validated, tested, and certified. However, the suit alleges that the CrowdStrike, quote, had instituted deficient controls in its procedure for updating Falcon and was not properly testing updates to Falcon before rolling them out to customers, end quote. Of course, CrowdStrike says it's going to vigorously defend itself. Jonna, do you think this lawsuit has legs?
I do. And Drew, I think it's actually very interesting on a couple fronts. One is that with the advance of regulations around cybersecurity, there's an ongoing question of what comprises validated, tested, and certifies, what comprises adequate versus deficient. Uh-huh. And there really isn't a way to get to an answer other than to hash it out in courts. And that'll be useful for everybody else, because if, regardless of which way it goes, at least people will understand, what do we mean by validated? What do we mean by deficient? Is doing what everybody else does acceptable, or is doing what everybody else does a flaw? I will also point out at a sub note that this actually is the second time this CEO has gotten in trouble with the same thing, cutting corners on testing. So I think it'll be very interesting the degree to which that's brought up in the lawsuit, and perhaps the board may want to think about not having a CEO that continually cuts corners on testing. Just a thought. Okay.
I feel like when these kind of outages happen, there's a lot of frustration from customers, but typically like sort of the licensing agreements they've got with their software vendors and other IT vendors sort of prevents lawsuits or prevents successful lawsuits. So the shareholder angle is usually the only option to pursue damages against tech companies. If you remember 2 weeks ago, we talked about how a judge dismissed most of an SEC lawsuit against SolarWinds. This was again around claims that SolarWinds had made about its security capabilities. The judge threw out most of the SEC strikes against those claims. So I guess it's going to come down to, for CrowdStrike, whether, how specific do claims and statements have to be, what constitutes best practices, as you mentioned, whether CrowdStrike was aware internally maybe of potential issues, was the way it was testing these particular updates. So I assume there's going to be a lot of pouring over of emails internally between CrowdStrike developers and executives as this lawsuit gets rolling.
Yes, and I think as another angle to this, of course, CNBC is reporting that Delta hired a well-known attorney, David Boies, to investigate options for seeking damages from CrowdStrike and Microsoft. Delta claims the crash led to thousands of flight cancellations and cost the airline up to $500 million. What's interesting here is the choice of attorney who previously represented the U.S. in a class action lawsuit against Microsoft, which forced the company to make Windows more hospitable to third-party software, which is kind of interesting and ironic in the current case.
Yeah, this is a case I feel like right now it's just I think Delta is just sort of posturing. They're kind of angry about what happened. I don't think they're actually, if they do try to take action against Microsoft, it's not going to go anywhere. Microsoft, regardless of David Boies being there, which I think is sort of them resurrecting a boogeyman that Microsoft doesn't like, as kind of a chest thumping move. But again, because of the end user license agreements that companies sign with these vendors, I don't know that Microsoft, and frankly, because I think it would be hard to say that this was Microsoft's fault, really, to prove that in court. So, good luck, Delta. Maybe the best they'll get out of it is maybe a little bit of a break in their licensing, but I'm expecting them not to get anything, frankly.
Yeah, I think you're probably right simply because of the challenges, but I will say that given the current context, I don't know that it's necessarily impossible to prove that it's Microsoft's fault. I do understand that there's certainly they're one of the two parties involved in this, but there's just been a lot of frustration going on within the government about this. So about more broadly about Microsoft's practices, as I've mentioned in previous podcasts. Mm-hmm. So I just think the environment is changing, and that's kind of what I'm really picking up on, is the environment has gotten to the point where there's widespread generalized frustration, and maybe it's just these lawsuits are expressions of this frustration and they will come to nothing. But I think they're worth watching for all the reasons you said.
Yeah, we'll definitely keep watching.
Okay, well, moving on. The latest Azure outage, which as you guys may be aware happened earlier this week, turns out to be the result of, wait for it, network misconfiguration. Yes, the network always gets blamed, right? It was a DDoS attack that triggered the Microsoft Azure environment defenses, but an error in the implementation of those defenses, according to Microsoft, resulted in an amplification of the attack rather than its suppression. Correcting the network configurations to support the DDoS protection efforts, followed by failovers to alternate network paths, resolved the majority of the problems with access to and traffic flow within Azure. So basically, Microsoft is saying, hey, it was a network problem, but we fixed it. All good.
Again, we've talked about cloud outages. They happen to every cloud provider. It's sort of an unfortunate string for Microsoft, given everything else that's happened over the last few weeks. It's not something you want to happen right after a massive outage like the CrowdStrike Microsoft one, but it happens. Microsoft took care of it, and I guess everybody's moving on. I didn't really see a lot of coverage about this anyway.
Yeah, there was a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt initially, but I don't think there was nearly as much damage as the previous one. And, yes, as you said, network configurations do cause outages. We try very hard to avoid that in the networking world, but sometimes it does happen.
Sometimes it's not the software.
Yeah.
Moving on, campus switch sales are expected to plummet in 2024. That's according to a new forecast from the Dell'Oro Group. The analyst firm predicts global campus switch revenues will tumble 16% this year. Why is that? Primarily because 2023 was a high watermark for campus switches. And we've talked about this before. So once supply chain restriction eased post-COVID, vendors are finally able to fill backlogs and meet pent-up demand. So that spiked 2023 sales. That means 2024 is a digestion period as customers kind of get that gear deployed and rolled out. Dell'Oro anticipates that campus switch revenues will return to growth in 2025 and continue through 2028.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting too that they're looking at the whole impact of wireless access points and not seeing that access points draw enough actual traffic to merit more than a 1 gig connection. And because of price sensitivity around 2.5 and 5 gig switches, if the parity closes, that might change, which is actually quite interesting because I think one of the areas to keep an eye on is how much traffic really is going over wireless going forward.
Yeah, it's interesting. Through the year 2028, Dell'Oro is estimating that 1 gig ports will account for 3/4 of all shipments in campus switching. Again, despite the advances we're seeing in throughput of wireless APs, I thought that was an interesting statistic. Something else, I had a conversation with Dell'Oro with Sean Morgan, who's a research analyst there. This doesn't show up in the press release we're linking to, but when talking about market share, HPE has an opportunity to pass Huawei as the number 2 seller of campus switches once that Juniper acquisition goes through, because the combined revenues with both companies could put them sort of just ahead of Huawei. Of course, that's if AP and Juniper can actually work together on a cooperative strategy and cooperative messaging if and when the deal goes through.
Yeah, I find that really interesting and perhaps a bit hopeful is the best way to put it. Interestingly enough, both HP and Juniper have cultures of being engineering companies and not marketing companies. And the sad reality is generally the market is overtaken by the people who market better than they engineer. And both HP and Juniper engineer better than they market. So I think your caveat is very well put. That said, I do know a lot of my defense contractor clients are very, very concerned about never doing anything that's Huawei and very happy to have an alternative to Cisco. So who knows? This may be, there may be a positive signs on the horizon for the combined company.
Yeah, I think the point about HP and Juniper figuring out a way to work together is going to be key because there are, I hate to use the word synergies, but I'm going to use it, that the two companies could bring together. But they do have to get that positioning right, that messaging right, even though it sounds like kind of dull stuff. It does work. There may be customers sitting on the sidelines watching this acquisition to see how things shake out. They may decide to go with another vendor if they think it's going to be a problem. So HP and Juniper do have an opportunity here. It's up to them not to bobble it.
Exactly. And by the way, if you're in marketing at Juniper or HPE, this is your chance. You can really make a difference. It's up to you guys.
Time to shine.
Right. The gauntlet is thrown. Moving right along, if you guys have been following this, DigiCert has been slating more than 83,000 SSL certificates for revocation as of yesterday. This has been an ongoing, almost a soap opera, because DigiCert, which is, of course, a major certificate authority, said it made mistakes in its DNS-based customer validation process going all the way back to 2019, and consequently will revoke more than 83,000 certificates. What has happened, and I'll dig into the technical details of why they did what they did and when they did it, but net, essentially they've been reaching out to their customers saying, you need a new certificate and you kind of need it in a hurry. One of those customers was Algius Technologies. They said, hang on, we can't change our 72 websites that fast. It's going to be an unacceptable disruption to business. They asked a court for a temporary restraining order, which was granted yesterday. So
that's
now,
August 1st.
That's August 1st.
Yeah.
Yes. That's right, because this is coming out on Monday.
Yes.
Okay. So one of the DigiCert customers, Algius Technologies, asked a court for a temporary restraining order, which was granted on Thursday, August 1st, based on the potential impact on its 72 websites. So what's happened is effectively DigiCert is putting the revocations on hold for a week. That gives everybody time to get updated certificates. You should reach out, make sure that you are not one of the affected bodies. If you are a cloud service provider, you probably aren't. DigiCert has said very clearly that there are two different pathways to grant certificates, and the high volume cloud providers are on one pathway and they are unaffected. That said, there's some rumblings that DigiCert has misrepresented the seriousness of this. DigiCert essentially made it sound like, oopsie, we forgot an underscore, and that's just going to be a problem. We're not going to accept any certificates as valid. One of the contributors to Bugzilla says that's actually not the case, that the actual reason for the underscore is so that services that allow users to create DNS records at subdomains can block users. And if you don't have the underscore, that means you can't do that blocking. And therefore, this is a security critical incident because there's a real risk, not a negligible risk, that this flaw could have been exploited to get unauthorized certificates. So Drew, any thoughts on all of this? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the way I read it was that this lack of underscore was essentially like, oh, that was the way we were identifying this sort of code we would send to you to know that it had an underscore. That yes, this was a DigiCert certificate, but you're saying there's more implications here. It's not just it's not just a lack of identity. That there's a problem here.
Exactly. And to be honest, I mean, you're not going to go revoke certificates unless there is a security implication. But I'm not surprised that DigiCert tried to downplay it, and they used all sorts of, classic downplaying kinds of things by saying it represents less than, I want to say 0.04% of all of our certificates. It's not a big deal, but of course it's a big deal if you're one of the companies affected.
Yeah, when you say 0.4%, it sounds small, but then you say 83,000 certificates, you're like, wait a minute, okay, that's real numbers.
Keeping in mind that those are 83,000 that have gone to individual companies, not to cloud providers where they might have been lost in the shuffle or never used. Mm-hmm. So there are people out there using these certificates right now, which is why I suggest, if you think you might be affected, you really want to look at it. Because another thing in all the documentation we read through, DigiCert actually said we're really having trouble reaching our clients who are affected. So don't just assume that if you haven't heard from DigiCert, you're not affected. It's possible they tried to reach you and somehow couldn't. But in any event, there may be a real security reason, and it is a breach. So it's something to bubble to the top of your priority list and get it fixed. If for no other reason, then your websites will all stop working on August 8th if you don't, and it does affect you.
Yeah, so I don't want to get conspiratorial, but it did seem like DigiCert was like really intent on getting people to update their certs right away. And obviously, of course, this is critical infrastructure, so you need to get it done. But there were customers who were like, I'm running critical infrastructure. I can't risk having a service outage or a service disruption on your time frame. I need to slow this down, which I think is probably what led to the lawsuit. But it does make me wonder then if there is something more to this issue that DigiCert was like, get it done now, quickly, drop everything and do it.
Well, I think at a practical level, having been involved in this when, back from the years when I used to do lab testing for a wide range of products, including security, that the instant you announce a vulnerability, it's 3, 2, 1 until it gets exploited. So we had at the time, we had a policy of making sure that we would let any security vendors where we discovered vulnerabilities in their solutions, we would give them a number of weeks to fix it before we announced it on the front page of Data Communications Magazine that we found a flaw in their system.
Yes.
So I think that could be a very simple reason that DigiCert is in a hurry. It's also, there might be a little bit more there. And for your pleasure in reading, you can read all the lawsuit documents. They're actually very polite from what I can tell. And in fact, Algius says, hey, we really are okay. We think we can use just 7 days. That'll be enough for us. So we're not asking the court to extend this any longer, which is actually kind of nice.
Yeah, so that link will be in the show notes, as well as Hacker News has a good story that has details if you want to check it out. Moving on, Intel says it's going to lay off 15,000 employees. That's approximately 15% of its workforce as the chipmaker tries to staunch its revenue bleed and return to profitability. An issue here is that Intel is banking on almost $20 billion in grants and loans combined from the U.S. government. That's supposed to come down as part of the CHIPS Act. The problem is that taxpayer investment was intended in part to help create jobs. So it looks bad for Intel to fire 15,000 people on one hand and then take billions of dollars from the government on the other.
Well, come on, you're leaving out an important point, though, Drew, which is they don't have the money yet. So it's really hard to pay people with money you don't actually have. And the Commerce Department is not saying whether the layoffs will affect the disbursement, but there's $8.5 billion in grants that hasn't been handed out yet. So, oops. It may be just a move to force the government to take action. It could also very simply be, as happens a lot of times with tech companies, you basically bury a strategic shift in layoffs. In other words, you lay off people who are not aligned with the new direction. And then when you have the opportunity, such as $8 billion in grants, you hire people in the new direction. And that is highly likely what's going on here because, the CEO has really made some, what one of my friends used to call company rolling strategic shifts. There's the bet of bringing fab plants back to the U.S. There are a lot of other bets that they've made. And these are very high stakes gambles, and one has to hope that he's made the right gambles. But when that happens, you want to clear the decks first and then hire people that align with the new strategy second. And that may be exactly what they're trying to do.
Yeah, possibly. My guess is that the money's still going to go through because, well, obviously creating jobs is a major point of the investment. The other major goal is to onshore chip manufacturing or re-onshore because we used to build chips. Aside from being a strategic industry for the U.S., investment in onshore manufacturing is also a hedge against potential disruption to Taiwan-based TMC, which the Chinese government considers a breakaway province that will eventually be, quote unquote, reunited with China. So if we have better manufacturing capabilities onshore in the U.S., if things go south in between Taiwan and China, then we may not, our economy and technical industry may not be crippled by that.
Well, and that's exactly what I meant about the bet, because the essential bet is that we can have a renaissance of chip manufacturing in the U.S. And I actually had a bet that I looked to lose because I had bet with one of my friends that this wasn't going to happen until past 2025. And it looks like these manufacturing facilities are actually opening faster than expected. So this is all good news for the U.S., all good news for the U.S. semiconductor industry, but terrible news for the actual humans affected by the layoffs. And we want to extend a virtual hug to you guys because it's a tough thing to go through. You have our sympathies, and believe me, it's not, don't take it as a reflection on you. Sometimes when these, giant strategic swings happen, you just get smacked in the head with them, and it sucks, but there it is.
Yeah, definitely. 15,000 people, it's definitely not personal. This is, as I said, Intel's bleeding, and they're trying to do everything they can to stop it. I will say, though, back in February 2023, when Intel was also struggling, Pat Gelsinger, the CEO, and other top executives announced cuts to their salaries. Gelsinger still took home $17 million in total compensation in 2023, so not a huge cut, and there's no word yet if executive salary cuts will be coming along. with this announcement of job cuts, but I think it would be a nice gesture.
Well, and at least at least job cuts in 2023 is directionally correct. You're not in the scenario where they're taking home record paychecks, which would cause me anyway to lose confidence in the company. Sometimes I think Elsinger has been very realistic about what it will take to reinvent Intel, and let's not fool ourselves. This is a reinvention.
It is,
so it may or may not work, but I think he's got a very clear strategy, a very clear vision, and painful as it is, the execution is what's necessary for the strategy to happen. So fingers crossed that it plays out downstream.
Yeah, and we'll be talking about Intel's latest financial releases coming up, but you've got a little bit, I guess, a bright spot for Intel with this next story.
Yes. As a matter of fact, Intel has reached out to Extreme to team up on network management via AI. And before you start gagging on me because everything is always about AI, it's important to understand that one of the few solid use cases that we found for AI in enterprise organizations has been for network management, because it can actually AI can actually reduce a lot of the noise, make signals clearer, and automate much more effectively than people had thought it was possible to even a year ago. So Extreme Networks and Intel have formed what they call a co-innovation alliance via Intel's connectivity analytics program. And the focus is using device data from network endpoints as additional feeds into Extreme's AI management, supplementing network performance data from other sources. So essentially the deal is Intel is giving a whole lot more data to Extreme with the hope that Extreme's AI is going to be more effective as a result. What do you think about that, Drew? Yeah,
data is definitely the coin of the realm for AI. Extreme gets a new data source. It can correlate with data it's already collecting about the network. Intel obviously has a broad presence on client devices, so that could be a rich source for Extreme. I think, it sort of depends on what metrics they're collecting, how they're collecting them, and, are their data models good? But, if Extreme can handle it right and get the right information, then yes, it could help with network management and monitoring as you're looking at performance issues.
Yeah, exactly. And again, this is just another sort of bright spot in strategy. Hope it pans out. But getting back to the money, how's Intel doing in terms of its financial results?
Yeah, not good. They announced their financial results for Q2 2024. Revenues were $12.8 billion. That's down 1% year over year. For net income, the company lost $1.6 billion. And as we mentioned earlier, Intel's firing workers as a way to help stop the bleeding. Shares fell after Intel released its results and also forecast a weak third quarter, so the pain will continue for a bit. However, there were a few bright spots amid the gloom. Revenues in Intel's PC unit were up 9% versus this time last year, and its foundry business, which Intel serves as the manufacturing foundry for other companies' chips, is up 4%. And building a foundry is sort of one of their key strategic initiatives. So I think that's a good sign. The company also said its Gaudi 3 GPU is going to ship in the third quarter. Intel claims Gaudi 3 offers twice the performance per dollar on inference and model training versus its competitors. It didn't say NVIDIA, but we all know it means NVIDIA.
Yeah, and, while I think we can agree that the bloom may be coming off the rose around AI, so it's questionable how much Gaudi has a chance to turn around Intel's fortunes, I'd like to point out that there are other uses for these GPUs. In fact, one of the fun things we've been looking at internally is the computational impact of fully homomorphic encryption. Not to go off into the future and talk about futureware, but what will happen is that there are going to be a range of applications that are going to require this computing horsepower, and having those chipsets already developed is a good thing.
I don't know if I've talked about it here or not, but I feel like even if we are in an AI bubble and a lot of money is being put into building out systems that may actually not find any revenue models, and that bubble bursts, I still think on the other side of that bubble, we're going to be left with a lot of infrastructure, a lot of compute capability that potentially could be used for other things beyond building yet another, chatbot. So yeah, there's other things these chips can do, and maybe we should start thinking about that.
Yeah, and that's why I think there's actually a bright market for them. So we'll be talking about that more in future episodes.
All right, two more stories before we wrap. Microsoft also announced financial results, and this is for their fourth quarter and fiscal year 2024. And it smiles all around. For Q4, Microsoft earned revenues of $64.7 billion, up 15% year over year, on net income of $22 billion, up 10% year over year. Full results were also very positive. They had revenues of $245 billion. So that's almost $250 billion, up 16% versus 2023, and net income of $88 billion, up 22%. Revenues were up across all the business units. Azure revenues up 29%, Windows revenue up 7%, Office commercial products up 12%, Office consumer products up 3%. I keep saying up. It was all up. Microsoft is up, up, up.
Well, and what I think is interesting in these results is really the degree to which Azure is up versus everything else, because, the CEO, Satya Nadella, came in with essentially the charter to go cloud. And as you recall, Microsoft was staggering in the cloud space. So the fact that Azure is doing so well is really a reflection of effective strategic goal, effective strategic execution here in a direction that isn't easy. And I will say, I am happy to say all sorts of negative things about Microsoft, but I will say this is the one company that has consistently reinvented itself since the days of client-server PC LAN computing and stayed on top of every new trend, not without pain. And just seeing those Azure revenues up 29% just reinforces the fact that it hasn't lost its ability to adapt to a changing market and changing technology space, even when you think it might have. So whatever else it doesn't do, it certainly is good at being adaptive and resilient, and the numbers show it.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I can't argue with that at all. And again, that is why Satya Nadella was brought on, because Microsoft could see things shifting from, the OS being the source of all their revenue to cloud. They transitioned, frankly, marvelously. They'll probably go down as like a business case studied in business schools for the rest of time.
Yeah, and I think Nadella also said, and I think you called this boilerplate, but that the company's performance speaks to, quote, the trust customers continue to place in Microsoft, and, quote, we are focused on meeting the mission critical needs of our customers, end quote, which all sounds wonderful. And as I look at that, I was just sort of wondering whether or not he's going to be summoned in any of these lawsuits from his customers. I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, there's not really any trace of humility or modesty in those comments, considering where Microsoft has just come from the past couple of weeks. But when you're sitting on that much money, I guess modesty is not an emotion that comes easily.
And I have to say, that much proof of your strategic wisdom, because it's not all that often that you get, a steady drumbeat of positive feedback that says this was the right call and you executed on it well. So hats off for that.
Yeah. All right, our last story for the day. I found an article about some marketing professors. They published a study of consumers that finds that when products are described as using AI, they are less appealing than identical products that don't include AI features in the description. More specifically, the researchers say that AI-based products decreases purchase intention and that would-be purchasers have a lower level of emotional trust in products that include AI in their descriptions. Now, this was about consumer products, but I wonder if they studied the enterprise market, if they would find a similar sentiment.
Well, I think it's interesting, but I read the abstract and I'm not entirely convinced, largely because it really depends on who they asked and how they asked it, and they didn't make that available in the abstract. So Shame on me for not downloading the entire article, but it was behind a paywall in my defense. So I think I think if you're interested in looking at the abstract or interested in looking at the article, the real question is, how many people did they talk to? Who were those people? What were the backgrounds of those people? And how exactly did they ask the questions? Because I think that really affects the answers. So I think it's directionally interesting, but certainly not even slightly conclusive.
The one thing I do know is I believe it was 1,000 people that they interviewed. But yes, how the questions are phrased and how they do the analysis.
And who those people are, that's the other thing. Because what I usually find in stuff that shows up in the newspaper, which is why I turn into one of those people that's, you kids, get off of my lawn, is that they'll interview people who are way too homogeneous to draw these sweeping conclusions. So if all those 1,000 people were college students or all those 1,000 people were, housewives or house husbands, it really becomes very difficult to draw broader conclusions.
That's true. I guess, maybe I'm cherry picking here, but I feel like we are, if not an AI bubble, I feel like there's going to be at some point an AI backlash. So I guess I feel like these findings are signals maybe that I'm looking for. And I wonder if it's consumers maybe just becoming a nerd to tech hype in general, or if they've either experienced poor results from like an LLM or just heard about them because lots of stories have gone around and developed a perception that AI is not as reliable as it's touted to be. But either way, I guess I'm sort of encouraged by those findings.
Yeah, no, I
But
think you're
again, how valid they are is up for grabs.
No, I agree with you on your macro view. I think we are in fact, I was just talking to one of my colleagues yesterday about, we're already seeing the early warnings of an AI backlash. And I guess for anyone who's listening, just, try to stay calm on the whole thing. AI was not going to change the world when they said it was, the way they said it was, I should say. But it's also got very clear use cases, and we're starting to see people come up with use cases that do have an ROI, so it is a useful tool like any other technology tool. It's just, I think we went off the deep end, yammering about, what was it, AGI, general intelligence. And I think the real problem is that marketing buzzword of intelligence got people really rattled.
Yes, absolutely. All right, that wraps up our news for this week. Jonna, if folks want to get more from you, where can they find you?
They can come hit us up at nemerdes.com and hit contact, and certainly want to hear from you. And they can also reach us on the Packet Pushers FU, correct?
Yeah, packetpushers.net/FU. The FU stands for follow-up. We love comments.
Sure,
we love correct. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it's the other thing. But that's up to you. That's your intention. But yeah, we do welcome comments, any corrections, or just, if you want to say hello, packetpushers.net/FU. We do take follow-up seriously, so please reach out. As always, thanks for listening.